My name is Jane Engel, and I will be your host this evening. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors. Café is presented by PPG and supported by contributions by individuals like you. Thank you to everyone who donated to the program. If you're unable to donate but would still like to support Café, the most helpful thing you can do is invite your friends to join the audience. Café takes place the first Monday of each month. You can register for next month's speaker at carnegiesciencecenter.org. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that there will be a Q&A after tonight's talk. Those of you joining us in person can ask your questions. Just be sure to use the microphone we bring around. Those of you joining us on Zoom can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can enter your questions at any time during the presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Scott Patterson. Scott Patterson is a meteorologist with over 18 years of experience working in the energy and transportation industries. He is known for his expertise in the boundary layer or near-surface atmosphere as it relates to day-to-day weather and extreme weather events, and the impact of energy and transportation infrastructure. Scott's current work involves developing insights about the influence of weather on the electricity grid, and specifically, renewable energy. Scott has previously provided weather forecast services to clients including United Airlines, the New York Port Authority, Utah DOT, and several additional state and provincial DOTs, ExxonMobil, the Special Olympics Airlift, and large music and outdoor markets in Palm Springs, London, Vancouver, and Mexico City. Scott has a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Kansas. And now, Scott.
Thank you. All right. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Okay, so as Jane mentioned, I'm a meteorologist. I work in renewable energy, and I'm basically going to run through a little bit about the electricity grid, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about renewable energy and how the weather plays into the production we get in the wind turbines and solar power, a little bit about hydropower, which is not really around here, but it is in the U.S., and it is part of what I do in my meteorology job. And then at the very end, I'm going to cover this unsung villain of climate change, to really talk about how climate change affects renewable energy, but not really the stuff that you see in the news. So it's more of the kind of in the shadows of things that are happening that may have a big impact in the future as we switch to more renewables. So let's see if this works. There we go. There we go. So before I get going, I'm just going to just kind of talk a little bit about what I've done and kind of the areas I've worked in. So these are all meteorologists. When I asked really about being a meteorologist, it's really about, what channel are you on? And most meteorologists are not on TV. Most meteorologists work either in one of three areas, academia, government, or in the private sector. So if you're in academia, you're a scientist, you might be a climate scientist, you may just be doing research. But if you work in the government, it's more like NOAA. There's several branches underneath NOAA, including the National Weather Service, which is primarily the main forecasting arm of NOAA. And then also there's a military meteorologist, and then there's a private sector. So I've been in the private sector my whole career for 18 years. And so what the private sector is you are basically an applied meteorologist. You work for several different kinds of industry. So in this case, I worked for United Airlines and some other aviation companies, and I was basically providing forecasts worldwide for their flights from the ground all the way up to cruising altitude. So one of the things I did that was kind of unusual at that job is I forecasted for volcanic eruptions. So we haven't had a lot recently, but when I was there in 2008, 2009, there were several massive eruptions along routes that are regularly flown to Asia. So I'm going to cover in the next slide briefly about one of those, but that's like one thing, like ash is bad for an engine in an airplane. If you encounter ash, you basically have to emergency land. It's a real immediate interaction, and so they avoid them at all costs. Another thing I did was I worked in surface transportation weather or road weather, and that's where I worked with the Utah DOT, the Nevada DOT, and then several in Canada and the rest of the US. And so in that kind of position, and you can see in the bottom right down there, it's one of the few pictures of me in the field. Basically in that position in the summertime, we would go out and service, what you can barely see in the background is a weather station. And so we would go out and maintain weather stations across Utah. So in Utah, there's about 70 stations. That picture is taken actually in July of 2011. There's still about 8 feet of snow in that drift, and there was 5 feet of snow walking out to that weather station. So we would go around though and mainly just work on fixing and making sure the weather equipment was working properly. The other thing we worked on is snowplows. And snowplows in the mountains in the west, you may have seen recently all the snow they had in California, 10 feet. In some places, that's their normal average for the entire year, fell in a few days. So I used to work with those kind of guys trying to plow that kind of snow. So if you go out there in areas they normally get that much snow, like out by Reno, up by Lake Tahoe, sometimes if you're driving somewhere around here, maybe you've seen, or in areas where a lot of snow, you'll see snow sticks on the side of the road that basically so they can see where they're plowing. Out there in Reno, the snow sticks are 20 to 30 feet tall, just because they get so much snow. So I would work with the snow plows, and I would help them understand, what kind of snow is falling, what kind of salt do you need in the back of the truck, because different salt is going to use different temperatures based on what the road temperature is and what the air temperature is. In the mountains, it can snow extremely heavy. Normally about an inch of snow per hour is enough to make the road impassable. The plows can't keep up, either here or there. But in the mountains, you can get 5 to 6 inches per hour in a lot of snowstorms. So they have to be ready for that. They know they're going to plow routinely over and over the same routes. And the other thing that they have to really worry about is it raining in the valleys and snowing up high, or is it snow down the valleys? Because they're going to have to staff accordingly. So a big thing with what I did with these guys was basically making sure they had the right manpower. Other things with that position, working in road weather, truckers are trying to move cargo, big routes in the west, big empty areas of no towns. They're moving across a lot of snowy areas. Wyoming is notorious for closing the roads when there's a big storm. They get stranded. They have to put chains on the trucks. So that's the kind of stuff I did. I worked with avalanche crews in Utah and up in British Columbia. Worked with ski resorts, and then also in the summer and fall, wildfires, big issue in the west. I made forecasts. I also worked with debris flows where basically after fire, just a little bit of rain and you can get all this mud and debris flowing down these very steep mountainsides, and it can basically go right down to the road. So it's a very dangerous situation, and if you can prevent it and mitigate it by alerting people down at the bottom that something's coming, they can close the road and nobody will get injured. So that's kind of what I did throughout my career so far, and now I work in in electricity. So, there we go. So this is the one I was going to cover, just really to show what people that work in applied meteorology do. So this is not just me. Other people do similar things like this, where you're basically thrown into becoming sort of a temporary expert in another field that meteorology may affect. So many people may have seen this top left image up here with the erupting volcano. So this peak was called Sarychev Peak. It's out in near the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. So it's like southeast, like eastern Russia by Siberia, and on the end of I don't know if I have this or not. At the end of that peninsula, right north of Japan, there's a little island. There's a series of them. They're all volcanoes. And so this one went off, and it went off in 2 phases. It went off, it erupted first, and you can see over here on this picture I drew. So this first one went off. It went up to about flight level for these airplanes. And so it went off, and the ash blew off into the ocean to the east. So you can see up here on this top image, this is actually sulfur dioxide that's part of an erupting volcano. But so this whole plume out here is the first eruption. And so what happened is normally you have any flights coming out of the eastern US, sometimes the west, they generally either fly over the North Pole into Asia, or they fly this more southern route and they go through Anchorage, they go just over the tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula and then down into Tokyo and Japan area, and they may continue further south. The big red dot right here is the Sarychev Peak volcano. So they're flying this way. They don't have a lot of alternates if there's something happens. They do have gas for alternates, but they're going to have to go into Russia, and they don't really prefer not to have to make an emergency landing there. So what happened here is this volcano goes off. The first airline that hit the ash, had to emergency land into Hokkaido, Japan. The second one was a United pilot. He was able to fly over the top of the volcano, of the ash, just barely. So and after that, everybody else was able to avoid it or turn around and go back to either Anchorage or some other, or just not fly altogether. So then another eruption happened where it went up higher and went toward Russia. So what that did is it pretty much cut off any sort of flying through here at all. This sulfur dioxide is pretty much matching where the ash was initially. And the problem with this is ash is very hard to detect in a cloud. It kind of mixes in, it's the same color. It's hard to detect if it's fallen out or not. You need to know how fast ash falls out. And so when I was thrown into this position of working several days in a row trying to cover this volcano, I had to figure out, I was researching how fast ash falls out, which I don't remember how much it does, but it does fall out eventually. But the SO2, which is the sulfur dioxide, it stays aloft for a very long time. It can go around the whole globe and not fall out. So you basically have sulfur dioxide, if you ever were to fly through it, it doesn't feel very good to you. It makes your body not feel good. It's hard to breathe. It burns. So they would prefer not to fly their passengers through it. So what they did is, and this is what we worked on, was a way to get around it, because it wasn't just United. It was every airline trying to go to Asia was having this problem. And so I worked with the United dispatchers, and so we devised this route. And it was a very nervous time, I remember, because they were very concerned about North Korea being so close to where they were going to have to go. And they largely avoided it otherwise, and also China and Russia. So they eventually did fly planes for a while into Russian airspace. I don't know if they actually went over China or if they just skirted the border, but they definitely came really close to China and also pretty close to North Korea, and then they were able to get planes into Tokyo and refuel, or that was their final destination. So this is just one thing I've done, and other meteorologists are doing, and this is the kind of stuff that they do in the private sector. So going over to what I do now in renewable energy, basically in the US, there's a special market, and there's several of them. And it's called the electricity wholesale market. So electricity is traded in this market, like the stock market. And so my company is one of the companies that trades electricity. And so what happens is they're looking for extreme temperatures, either hot or cold, anything where there's going to be either really hot temperatures or high heat index, where it feels really hot. So very humid conditions. And it doesn't have to be where it's normally humid. If it gets humid in DC, that's a big deal, because DC has lots of people, and the demand for electricity will go through the roof. So then the price for electricity will also go up. So what they're doing is they're trading on those prices going up. And the same with cold air. And basically, when it gets hot, people turn their air conditioning on. That's the demand. So when it gets cold, same thing. They turn on their heater. And there's natural gas in it as well when it gets cold. But there's electricity demand and natural gas. And both of them are tradable. And so they're trading on those in the cold. If it comes in less cold than expected or less hot than expected, then the prices will not go as high and people will lose money. So they're trying to be on the right side and be just perfect and make money, obviously. But it can be very difficult, just depending. There could be thunderstorms that come through and wipe out the temperatures that day. Even though it's really hot, they could come through overnight and just destroy the temperatures. And that's happened. And then there's big losses. And so that's what I do. What I do is I look at the weather. I tell these traders, this is what I think is going to happen. These are going to be the max temperatures in these cities. And this is the risk things. Is there a thunderstorm risk? Is there clouds going to sit in there too long? That's what I do. And so I do it for the max temperature, and then in the wintertime, it's more like the morning and the 4 p.m. temperature. And sometimes they want to look at the evening temperatures too. If the temperature is going to hang up longer than like just falling off when it gets dark, that's also a reason people might keep their air conditioner on into the evening hours. Like sometimes when it's really humid in Pittsburgh and you want to open the windows, but it's just like unbearable just through the overnight period, that's something they can trade, because everybody is going to keep their AC on, and it's very unusual for that to happen. So then that is going to drive the prices up, because the people who run the grid may not expect that to happen. And even though you would think they would expect it, because they can look at the forecast, they don't often expect it. So it's a thing where they can make money. One other area where I can forecast something that they can make money is cloud cover. If it's cloudy after sunrise or before sunset and it's very dark outside, what happens? The street lights come on. You keep your lights on in your house. If this happens, this creates an extra demand that a lot of people aren't expecting, and so the price goes up. The demand for electricity, it goes up in the morning just for those lights, and in the afternoon and evening it comes up as well earlier. Otherwise, most of the demand in the evening comes up when people come home from work. They come home from work, they start turning on stuff in their house, then you get the residential demand. During the day, people are at work, all the skyscrapers, that's all demand for electricity. So it's either going to be air conditioning, heating, or it's going to be the cloud cover and the lighting. So the electric grid this is basically the electricity grid, and it's just a bunch of high voltage transmission lines all over the U.S. And you can see it up here in like the plains. There's not a lot, but there's not a lot of people up here, and there's no reason to have. There's not many power plants in this area. There's a lot of renewables in here because it's a good place for wind, but there's really most of your transmission lines and where it's really high density of transmission lines is out here where the people are living. And so the power on this is much higher than you would use in your house. This is really high voltage. It's coming from the power plants. It goes on the lines, and then it comes down to your house. So this is the kind of power plants you may see. Like there's coal. Coal's coming. They're trying to take them out as they bring renewables in. There's some risk to that. The big benefit or the big pro for fossil fuels like coal, natural gas in the top right, oil, any other fossil fuel type plant, is that they're always on. They're always available. They're easy to bring them on if they need extra power. But renewables' biggest thing against them is that they are inconsistent, because renewables are just what they sound like. They renew, but the weather is the reason they renew over and over. It's just you can continuously get power, but it doesn't mean it's consistent. So you could have no wind, and you're like, we need power, and there's no wind power available. What are we going to do? We have to bring on a really expensive, like a peaker plant, or it's like a natural gas plant that can come on real fast. It's very expensive. It's not a great option. They don't want to have to do that, but that's where fossil fuels can come in and be a benefit in that case. But they're not clean. They're heavy polluters. So as we go into climate change and that becomes more and more of an issue, we want to go away to clean energy, but that's the issue. So until we get battery power that can hold enough power to really sustain us for more than a few hours, it may not be totally feasible, so they're going to keep the coal plants on as long as they can, and the same with all the other fossil fuels. So this is basically what happens when the power is created. It's created at whatever power plant or renewable. They put it onto the high voltage transmission lines, and you've seen them probably anywhere around all over the place. The big metal structures, those are the high voltage lines, and then that power is way too much to actually use in your house. So before it gets to your house, it goes through a substation. They basically knock the power down to a level that your house can use. Then that goes basically on to the power poles you see that are wooden around town. That's what the utility runs. So that's where the power comes to you through those. They're called distribution lines. And so if you're getting power outages from a storm, from like a thunderstorm, it's coming from your utility lines. It's not with the big grid. The big grid's really affected when you have massive cold or massive heat over a large scale area where it affects many, lots of people are turning on their air conditioning or high demand for electricity. That's when you get big impacts to the grid. So the markets that I work in are these are the markets. So ERCOT you may have heard of because of the issues they've had with ice, and in the summertime they had last year they had a really hard time with keeping the power on with the heat they were having. So ERCOT is kind of likes to operate by themselves. They are connected to SPP, which is Southwest Power Pool, and they are connected to this little part of MISO. But they like to just operate by themselves. They could send power, but they don't. They just kind of do their own thing, and when there's an issue, they have to deal with it on their own. The rest of everybody else does, California's kind of out here by themselves. And they do also operate mostly by themselves, but they also, I believe, work with some of the states out here that don't have a market yet. And I know they do a lot of, there's a lot of transmission lines going to the north here, and so they do a lot of trade energy or supply energy, or it's part of their market sometimes for up here near Portland and Seattle. But the other areas, SPP is largely the Central Plains, and a lot of their renewables are wind. there's a lot of the solar is really in California and Texas, and there is more solar in like North Carolina and some places, but it's smaller. Florida also has a lot of solar renewables, but most of the wind power is West Texas to the Canadian border, and then MISO has a significant portion of wind, and there's some in PJM and these other states, New York and up to New England. So getting into renewables, so as I mentioned, renewables you can renew, obviously, it just returns constantly because of the weather. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hydro. Hydropower is largely either, there's two ways mainly. There's pump storage, which I don't do a lot with because the weather doesn't really change how they operate. And then there's the hydro dams. And there's little hydro dams. I think there's some around here on the Allegheny, but there's very large dams, like you can think of Hoover Dam in the west. But there's many large dams all over the West and in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. So that's where you're going to see a lot of your hydropower. California has a lot of reservoirs which are now full, and they're going to get really good hydro likely this year as the snow melts. It'll go in the reservoirs and it'll power their hydro. Wind power, generally, created by wind. The big downside to wind power is it peaks at night, and I'll show you in a minute why. So that's the peak demand for electricity is during the day. So that's a real big reason why batteries would be great, if they could store the wind in batteries and then use it during the daytime. Solar, obviously, is the sun, and there's different kinds of solar that they have out, and I'll show you in a minute. But solar is basically, it's produced by the sun, but there's most of the solar panels that are just the ones that absorb, the PV, the photovoltaic solar panels you might see on someone's house or on your house. Those panels can operate, and you may have seen this if you own them, if you have them, that you don't need sunlight necessarily, and the big utility scale farms are this way. You just need ambient light. They don't need to have direct sun. And if it's too hot, it actually reduces the efficiency. So places in the desert, they get really big clear skies in the summer, but when it's really hot, they don't actually get max solar because they're losing efficiency just because the temperature is too hot. So this is pump storage. This is Alleghenies in northern Pennsylvania. This is one example. There's one in Virginia, and they're around the world. So this is the one I don't really deal with, but this is a kind of hydropower. And I just put it on here because it's kind of cool how it works. So during high demand, the upper pool you can see up here on the top left. So this pool will drop into a tube, and they'll let it flow down to a generator that's underground, and that will turn a turbine, and that'll create electricity. So when there's a high demand, they'll do that. At night, usually, when there's a low demand, they pump it back up from the lower to the higher one. And so they often use renewable energy to do the pumping. So it's a clean process of pumping it back up to the upper pool. They have one in Bath County, Virginia that's pretty active in the grid, and this one is as well. And then I think there's some in Canada as well and around the world. And then this is the main kind of hydro. When people think of hydro power, this is the main one. So this is the Grand Coulee Dam in north central Washington on the Columbia River. So the Columbia River has several dams, and they're very large, and they produce a lot of power for Washington, for Oregon, and British Columbia has some as well. So basically, what happens is, and you may have seen stories about what's happening in Lake Mead and Hoover Dam, is the intake valve. There's an intake tube under the water you can't see. The water flows into that, flows down to several turbines. Usually, there could be up to 20 I saw in one dam, so they're producing a ton of power at the turbines, and then the water flows out into the river. You can see the spillway on here. That's what's overflowing. That looks really active right in the middle of the dam. And so when I make a forecast for hydropower, it's usually a 9-month forecast. You make it in October, and you make it all the way for May of next year. And the reason you make for the May is that's when the snow melts. The peak snow melt is in May, early June in this part of the country. And the same for a little bit earlier for California, but it is in the spring. So the whole goal is to understand what the flow is at the dams. So the flow in the dam is measured in cubic feet per second. And it's basically, when you make this kind of forecast, such a long range, there's no model to look at. It's using a lot of analogs. You're looking at similar years that set up the overall pattern looks similar. You're making a long-range forecast, and then you're predicting how much snow is going to fall. And then you have to think about, well, is it going to be hot? Is there going to be any heat waves in spring? Is it going to be a warm spring or cold spring? Cold spring, the snow will stick around till May, and you'll have an on-time melt and an on-time flows. But if it's an early melt, you're going to lose that snowpack real fast. And so you could have an early May. And so that's what the traders are betting on. So they're trading electricity on the time it occurs and how much. And so the one I forecasted for most of these dams in Washington, these are all dams, these blue circles. The Grand Coulee is this one. You can see the river starts in British Columbia, flows north actually, and then comes back down. And so all the mountains in here get snow. And so over here on the right, this is the NRCS. It's a great site to look at hydro, water, anything with water, river levels, snowpack. It covers the whole country. I just zoomed in on the Pac Northwest. But what it's showing is a snow water equivalent. Snow water equivalent is is basically the snow has melted. It's showing you the water, and then I'm looking at the percent of normal at this time of year. So this is actually from February, I believe I pulled it, just a few, last week or so. And on here you can see basically the snow right now out there. Even though they've had a lot of snow in California, they haven't had a lot compared to normal in the Pac Northwest. So up here they've had just average snow to a little bit below average. So if you're looking at, if I had made the forecast, a good forecast would be that it's going to be average flows. They're not really maybe even below average. And the big risk for these guys, and I looked at British Columbia a little bit too when I was making this presentation, is they're a little bit lower, is going to be fire weather. We're going into an El Nino, and El Nino will lead to dry, hot weather up in their area. So they don't have a lot of snow compared to down south. They just have average. If it melts too fast into the summer, they could be looking at fires. And they know that, and that's the kind of trend. They're going to go back and forth. They have a big snow, then not a big snow. So you can see a lot of big snow higher than normal out here. This will all drain into North Dakota and go down to the Mississippi, just draining off the right of the picture. So this is solar. So this is what a real utility scale solar that goes on the grid looks like. These are the big ones. So this is in California. They're all over California, Nevada, Arizona, and then Texas is finally catching on. They have a lot of sun, and they're building like crazy. So there are littler solars. Again, Florida has a lot of solar, but they're smaller up through the Carolinas. And then also up in the Midwest, they're starting to build more solar as they realize that they don't need as much sun as they have down in the south. They can still use that solar. It's still useful to them. So this is from the SEIA. It's the solar database. And so all the yellow is the current solar plants that are already built. And then you have your under construction. That means they are working on them. They actually have been funded. And there's a high likelihood, most of them that they start to build, they do build and they finish them. So all the yellow and reds are most likely going to be actual solar. And you can see I zoomed in a few areas over here on the right. So Texas has a lot of solar out by what is San Angelo, Fort Stockton, Midland, where all the oil drilling is as well. Out there is where most of the solar is in Texas. They started building a lot near Houston recently, and they can see they're starting to build more out near east of Dallas. Also in the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. So here it's really starting to take off more than it has. I really don't look a lot at solar in that area because there's not a lot. It's really dominated by wind power. So they have discovered that it's worth it to build it because wind power is so much of a nighttime thing, and they need more for the daytime when they have these heat waves especially, or even the really cold weather we had this December. It would have helped if they had solar, because even though we had that cold weather, even though it's cold, solar is not really affected by the cold. It can do fine in cold. It's the heat that causes the inefficiencies. So there's different kinds of solar, and so this is the one's probably the lesser known one. And so this one at the top left, if you've ever flown into Vegas and been on the right side of the airplane, or the correct side of the airplane, you can see these from the airplane. So there's 3 of them. They're circular, they're big mirrors. They don't absorb the sun, they reflect it. And they reflect it at that central tower, and that tower has these molten salts in there. The salts create steam, and they drive a turbine, and that's what creates the power. Now, they're very bad for birds. Birds fly through, and they're immediately on fire. And it's just because it's so much heat. So, and the other thing with this kind of thing, and the other one on the top right, is a very similar. It's the same mirror, but instead of focusing it on a tower, it focuses it on that bar that runs the length of them, this bar. So this bar has a liquid that also creates steam, and that steam runs to the end to a turbine. So you can kind of see on this diagram on here how these work. And so the big downside of these and why there's not more of them, they have them in Florida, they definitely have them in the Vegas area, a few of them. But if it's cloudy, there's absolutely no solar. They don't get ambient light, it doesn't matter. They need the full sun to hit them to get to really focus the energy on in this case, on the pole that goes down the middle and on the tower. So it can be very hit or miss. If there's clouds, and they do have them, it's just like there's no solar. So they're not as good as the PV kind of solar as, because that can work with ambient light. So this is the one that's the main, most popular. So in a solar farm or on your house, it's similar, it's not exactly, but you have this huge array of the photovoltaic panels are usually black, they absorb the sun, they convert to electricity, and then they go to an inverter and they come in DC power and it converts it to AC, which is what we use. It can go into a battery bank, which is, they're getting more and more batteries that can hold power longer. So they're starting to use batteries in conjunction with these. And then it goes basically through the transformer and it puts it onto the transmission lines and goes off to your house or to a substation, or it may go to another power plant area. So this is what a solar curve looks like, and the blue line is a wind curve. So this is California ISO. They have really good graphics, free to the public. Some of the ISOs, which are the different markets, they don't have very public stuff. So this is one that is public, and so you can see it kind of peaks up there where that weird little drop is. That's kind of the peak solar. So this is in last year in July. So this is what happens in the summertime. This is a unit of power, this megawatt. They get about 14,000 last year. This year already in March, which as we go through the spring, the sun angles are still kind of low, so we don't get the best solar we can get in the summer. But we've already seen them this year get to 14,000. So I think they've added some more solar farms. And so this year they'll likely peak higher. But this is what it looks like. Now you see wind is higher here in the evening and the morning. And so that's the problem with wind. At the highest time, when the demand's the highest for electricity, wind's the lowest. And sometimes this wind is 0 in California during the day. Oh. So then this is a storm they just had last week, or I think it was this week or the one before that. And you can see they only got about 7,000 of the megawatts. I guess it's kind of, it's hard to read. But this storm with all these clouds, this is what happened to the solar when it got hit with all the clouds. So this is the kind of thing that where the traders, this is where they can trade on, is understand that there's going to be a huge impact with this kind of cloud cover. And it's different kind of clouds, high clouds, clouds kind of in the middle atmosphere, and then low clouds. So California doesn't get a lot of low clouds, just the way they are set up. They don't get a lot of fog. They do in the Central Valley where Bakersfield up through Sacramento is, but it's really just one time a year when they get that. So most often they're just getting hit with when there's big storms coming through. That's the big impact. Over here on the right, you can see throughout the year, you get like higher and higher sun angles. So even a full sun in the dead of winter, they're not going to get as much as they are in the summer. The angle of the sun is just too low for them to get that. Now in Texas has a different problem with cloud cover. Texas and everybody else east of the Rockies, they get what is called a temperature inversion. Now you should remember that word because I'm going to talk about it a lot here. But a temperature inversion creates low clouds and ice and all kinds of things. And it's really bad for renewables. So it occurs all the time, but Texas gets them bad in the winter, and it basically covers the solar with really low dark clouds, and they get very low output. It also takes out the wind. So it's a really bad scenario if you're faced with a situation where renewables need to be what's supplying the power. You're not getting that. So the prices go through the roof, as we saw when they had the ice storm in Texas. Now, the ice is not abnormal in Texas. They have ice every year. It's not that wasn't that big a deal. The temperatures in that storm in 2021 in Texas were extreme. That was the anomaly. And then also there was lots of mess ups, not with the renewables, with the fossil fuels, how they managed in the cold weather. That was the problem with that storm. So trends in solar power and kind of in the grid are to go to microgrids. And microgrids are basically, so solar, you can put a solar panel on anything really, as long as you can have an inverter and you can kind of connect it to everything. But basically, there's lots of parking lots, there's lots of stores, shopping centers, hospitals. They have big parking lots. They have places to put solar. So they're building out And they're not just using solar, they're using other kinds of renewable energy, but they're basically creating like a power plant, which is based in this case solar, right in the middle of an urban area, right where the power is being used. So that's super important because instead of making it go across transmission lines for hundreds of miles, you can make it right where you use it. So then if there's a bad weather or extreme event and the grid goes down, it doesn't matter. You have power on site. You're using the power. If you have batteries, even better. You can store the power and you'll have more power if say it's cloudy and your solar's not getting much. You can use the batteries. The other thing that can happen with electric vehicles is they're working on is more two-way power. So basically the electric vehicle becomes a battery and it can pull up and it can send power into the grid, or in this case, into the microgrid. So this is a big deal if they can get the technology worked out. There's definitely several projects, many projects, across the US where they're working on different technology, working with utilities to figure out how to connect these microgrids because it can be such a game changer for the grid. Nope, there you go. And then the other trend in kind of electricity, which I think is going to be a huge issue, is heavy duty charging. So not just your regular individual personal car, they're also working on heavy duty semi-trucks, buses, dump trucks, cement trucks, other kinds of things like street cleaners. I mean, everything that uses really high amounts of power, they're working on getting charging for that. And the problem is that going to strain the grid when the grid's already being strained during extreme weather? Is it going to further strain it, or they say they can handle it, but I am not a believer. I think it's going to cause some issues when you have a significant storm. You can't get the power to one area where these might be, especially outside or even inside urban areas. Basically a truck stop. They may make a truck stop into a charging station, and then if there's a big storm and all the trucks are stranded, all of them are going to be trying to charge by sitting there, and then you're going to have all the demand of all the residents of that city or in that area also trying to get power. So it could be a really big issue. This is where microgrids could come into play. They may have to build on-site power just for these things, just to charge, because they're going to try to charge these trucks in an hour. And so you imagine how much power, it takes a lot of power just for a car, but for a big truck, it's going to take a very large, about a megawatt of power. And so some of these, like the littlest solar farms are 100 megawatts. Your house is like 0.0001 megawatt. It's such a small amount, and they're trying to say, like, I want 1 megawatt of power for just to charge these trucks. So it's going to be significant because then you have to have them every like 150 miles. So there's a lot of truck charging and stations are going to have to take place, and then you consider how big it is from California just to get to the Central Plains. And then you consider the mountains, and it's such a really hard task. So the people that are working on that in REL, they are a laboratory, just focuses on renewable energy, where this graphic came from. So they are working on exploring how to get this off the ground. So now I'm going to go into wind power. So I actually took this picture. It's in near Amarillo, Texas. This is the Panhandle Wind Farm. And so this is what a normal wind turbine looks like. If you've ever driven out to Altoona, driven anywhere really in Pennsylvania eastward, you've seen these on the ridges. Actually, the farms in Pennsylvania are very small compared to what you see out in the Midwest. But it's the general design. It's a 3-blade rotor type, and it's a horizontal design. There's also, if you may have seen a vertical turbine, they're like this, like a column, and they also spin, but they don't take up very much space. But they're not very good, I think, for these. I think generate a lot more power. So normally most of these are about 80 to 100 meters tall. And so you can see on there, I converted it for you if you don't know meters, 262 feet roughly. To the ones offshore, they're the ones that are about almost 1,000 feet tall. That's just up to the nacelle or the hub. So you have the tower here, these are the blades, and then this is where most of the action's going on that's making the power in the nacelle. And so when the wind hits these, they'll turn, and inside, that's where you'll get the turbine to turn. So very long, and the blades are also very long as well. If you've seen them going down the highway ever, they are really, really long. It takes a special kind of truck to carry them. The ones offshore, because they're taller, can be longer. So you can see something as long as a football field, an American football field, and And so that's the bigger area they can swing through is the more wind. And the newer turbines, the bigger they are, the slower they can go and produce the same amount of wind that the other smaller turbines do at faster speeds. So they can basically put these up and with less wind get the same production. So it's kind of big development. And so this is the inside of a turbine. So the wind's blowing, it always blows into where the point is. So it wants to flow perpendicular into the turbine. Any other direction is not optimal wind direction. And so these turbines can on their own, they basically turn into the wind. And they use this anemometer on the back. So the anemometer will tell the wind speed. This little wind vane little thing will tell the direction. And the whole wind turbine will turn to face the wind. And that's what this yaw motor does. The yaw motor turns it. The other thing that can happen is this pitch system. It can turn the blades in and out, just like an airplane will mess with the wings to lower or raise as you're landing or taking off. This is the same thing this pitch system does. Now when it turns the shaft. The shaft is not moving that fast, so they use these gears in here to speed it up. So the gearbox is where it speeds up, and then it turns the turbine, and that creates the electricity. The electricity flows down the tower into the ground and connects with the other wind turbines. The brake is very important. The brake is needed because this can't spin at endless wind speeds. At some point, it will break. So it's about 45 to 55 miles an hour. If it gets that with the anemometer, it will stop the turbine automatically. Turn it off, and when it can, I don't know how long it is, but at some point, it will turn on automatically by itself. Now, if there's a big icing event, ice is a big issue for wind turbines. They're supposed to have heaters in the blades, but it doesn't seem they turn them on very often. So when they get icing, it's basically, there's different kinds of icing, but all of them have a similar effect. It coats the blade, or it sticks on part of the blade, and it makes it not aerodynamic anymore. It's not perfectly going to flow through the air. So most often, if it's an isolated event, the actual turbine will sense it and turn off. If it's a wide scale, an operator somewhere will turn the entire farm off, which is a big deal for trading, because oftentimes where you have icing, you have very strong winds. And if they turn the turbines off when everybody thought they're going to have them on, then all of a sudden there's no power coming from that area, and it affects the entire grid, and prices tank, and people lose money. And so it's a big deal trying to term icing. It's very hard to figure out when it's going to stick, and a lot of times, and when it's not. So it's one of the main things that I deal with in the winter is types of icing. So this is the wind database. This is actually available on the USGS site. I put it down here. It's kind of a cool site. You can't really tell on here how cool it is because you can't zoom in, but this is like showing all the wind farms. So you can see right here, there's a significant number and growing of wind farms by Chicago. Now this is the PJM MISO markets having people build these. They want them there because there's an issue with power flow to Chicago, power flow to Indianapolis, Detroit, and then also power coming in from Iowa. So there's been a really big buildup of new farms in this area. The other areas are western Iowa up into southwest Minnesota, South Dakota up into North Dakota. It doesn't look like on here, and there's not a lot of huge farms, but this plays a major role only because there's a lot of power being put on the grid, and Bismarck doesn't need that much power, and it's the only big city up there. And so they have to send the power to the east. Once you make the power, you have to use power. If you don't use the power, you have to dump the power. You can't just like store it unless you have somewhere to store it. But they don't. So they make money. There's money to be made when the transmission lines start overflowing with power. If that happens, they have to move it onto other transmission lines. And you start getting what you get in traffic when you're driving. You start getting gridlock everywhere. And when they get that, prices all over the place go up. They can basically bet on individual transmission lines. So it's not a bet. They're playing a market. They're not gambling. And so that's what they do. And so you also have, sorry, jumped ahead. Okay. You also have a lot of wind farms, and it's hard to tell here is too, in Texas, up through Kansas. Not as much in Nebraska or most of South Dakota yet. There is a lot of wind farms going on in Colorado, starting to get into the games. Wyoming could be an amazing wind farm state, but they are so pro-coal and fossil fuels, they refuse to let, and this is true, they refuse to let wind turbines be built. So it is one of the windiest states. They would have a lot of wind production, but they just don't want to have anybody build them. And people will come in and want to build a wind farm and transport it all the way to California. They will build a transmission line, but Wyoming will not let them. So that would be some good production. There's a lot of wind in that one area. You also get a lot of wind up here in Washington State, and what is like a desert out there, and this where they have these wind farms. And these wind farms, and California is right here, they only get wind when wind is blowing in one direction. They have some older turbines. They cannot turn into the wind. So when the wind blows from the east, they get nothing. And it's kind of, they should replace them all. Somebody should come in and replace them because it is such a loss of possible energy, especially California. When they have Santa Ana and wildfires and they need the power when it's really hot in Los Angeles, these wind farms have zero power. So it's kind of a really big design error. Other areas were down here. So you can see kind of zoomed in. I have zoomed in a little bit on some of the clusters of farms here, but it's basically, there's a lot of farms all through Iowa. I look at these farms every single day and try to forecast how much production they're going to have. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is why, this is a little bit of computer models, and this is kind of what I look at most days. So this is why there's wind, where there's wind. And I always tell myself, if I'm questioning like what's going on in a wind farm, they build wind farms because there's wind. There's wind there, so they built it. And sometimes they build them out like randomly by themselves, and I always have to tell myself that's why. So this is what normally happens most of the time, most of the year. You get something like this almost every day, sometimes every few days, where when a storm system comes into the U.S., just because of how the U.S. is geographically configured, when a storm system comes off the Pacific, it automatically, through things I'm not going to speak about here right now, it's very complicated, it transitions energy to the east of the Rockies. So right along the east of the Rockies, you get what we call a lee side low. It's on the lee side of the mountains. So it forms somewhere from eastern New Mexico all the way to Montana. We get these lows, and this is the lows that come to Pennsylvania. They form there, and they move across the country, and these are the storm systems. So a low is a storm system. A high is not. A high is good weather, usually clear skies, sometimes really hot. So this will form here, and what it does is when this forms, it creates what we call a low-level jet. So this is a low level, and low in the atmosphere is 5,000 feet. Between 2,500 feet and about 5,000 feet above the ground, you get these very strong winds. So the wind scale is over here on the top of this image, and this is in knots because in weather we use a million different kinds of units. So this is in knots. I forecast in miles per hour, and some of these graphics are in meters per second. So I'll help you convert, but basically in knots, it's really close to miles per hour. It's not very much different at these speeds, but basically you're seeing winds of 45, 55 miles an hour, all the way from Texas, all the way up to Montana. And so this is where a lot of wind farms are. There's a lot of wind farms in Oklahoma that will get some wind from this wind that occurs here. And you see it's not really in Iowa in this one, but they will still get some wind during the day. Basically this whole area will shift to the right, to the east as we go through the daytime. And so this is what we're looking for, a low-level jet. This is the optimal wind setup for the wind farms to bring in max winds. This is a different day over here. This shows you why those wind farms are built near Chicago. This is not infrequent. This is a very frequent setup with the storms come across, and then this is the same low. It's moved across more into Iowa area or Minnesota, and it creates the same thing, a low-level jet. And so this is like 50, 60 mile an hour winds above the turbines. But what happens is these winds will make their way down to the surface. Not totally to where like we are, but down to the turbine level. So we might have like a 15 mile an hour wind at the surface, and the turbines are ripping along at 30 mile an hour. Now, it doesn't sound that strong, but the max efficiency of a turbine actually occurs about 26 to 29 miles an hour. So everything above that is just, they're running at max, and eventually they actually start losing power. They get a little bit inefficient when you get up in the 40 mile an hour range. So it's really optimal, not that much wind. At 26, 29 miles per hour is where you get the best wind. So, okay. So this is the average wind speeds at 100 meters. So this is about where the turbines are, and this is why they built those farms in Chicago. They have a little bullseye here. It's a really good location for them. They get pretty good winds here on average. So you can see this is in meters per second. So at these wind speeds, it's really close if you just double that number, and that gets the miles per hour. So that's kind of the average wind they have, but they get a lot higher wind a lot of days and lower wind. So that's the average of that. So what you have here is very strong winds. You can see this is why the turbines are where they are. There's also some good wind, even though it's not purples, but they have good wind in South Texas. And then you can see a few areas out here where they have these oranges. That's where some wind farms are. And then you can see off the coast, this is why they want to build offshore. There's very good, consistently strong winds just off the shore. So they are working on, I know there's some in Texas they're working on, and a few out here in off the east coast of the US. Oh, and lastly, I want to talk about this thing over here. So this is a power curve. So this is essentially how the power ramps up as the winds go. So the wind speed here is in meters per second again, so if you kind of double it, that's miles per hour. But you can see it's just really quickly after about 8 or 10 miles an hour, quick ramp up, and then you're really quickly at max winds. And then once it gets to max, it stays at max, and then so this farm, I think, right after this turbine, right after this drops off because they get to their cutout speed where the wind gusts are too strong. And this up here is the kind of, this is how we know what kind it is. So this V is Vesta. Vesta is one of the major wind turbine brands. And so this is their turbine. And so this means, this 82 means that the diameter from one tip to another is 82 meters. So it tells us how big the blades are right off the bat. And then it tells us the power in kilowatts. So it's basically 1.65 megawatts or that many kilowatts. So that tells us how much power one turbine can produce. Then we multiply it by the entire farm, which could be hundreds of turbines, to get the output. And we use that to create curves that we give to the traders. So this is kind of zoomed in just for Texas. So you have, you can see kind of where there's really good wind in Texas. Now Texas has, I believe, the highest amount of megawatts, or basically the highest amount of power of any state in wind for wind farms. So they have a significant number out here near San Angelo. Another really core area is around Abilene, Texas. And then they have a lot up here in the Panhandle. And there are some down here in South Texas. There's really not much out here, but because there's not as much wind. And you can kind of see on here where those wind farms are. Uh-oh. Okay, I can't get to work. There we go. So this is a windrose, and we use this to see what the average wind direction is. So this is very useful. It's off of the Iowa State has a really good mesonet, and this is what it's like observations across Iowa, but they also do the whole country in terms of some products. So this is actually for Allegheny Airport. So just up there, just to the just east of us right now. And so you can see this is the average for the whole entire year. So we get an average southwest wind. So basically with wind, when we say directions, the direction, when we say a southwest wind, it's blowing from the southwest toward us. We don't say southwest wind to describe where it's going, because what we want to know is what kind of land, what is it, if it's coming from the southwest, what is it blowing across to get to us? We want to know because the temperature of the ground affects the temperature of the air. So we want to know if it's from the southwest, that's usually a warm air, warm weather, and so that's what we really want to know. So that's what we use. We use this for wind. I want to show you I forgot, I can't use that. Okay, so up here is Lyman, Colorado. These are wind farms. All these little groups, the dots are actual wind turbines, and the average wind flow based on the windrows over there is from the south and from the north, and the reason is because the Rockies are right to the west of this. Right off to the left are the Rockies, it's Denver. So basically they built these wind farms so they would collect the best wind. So this is, the reason those farms were like they were is because they try not to build them like one behind the other, because you get what's called wake turbulence. So similar to when you're taking off in an airplane, there's a delay between the plane that took off and you, because there's turbulence right behind you. You don't want to fly into wake turbulence behind another airplane because you could crash. So they put a delay between airplanes for that reason. So, and you can see the farm on the right. I'm not sure what farm it is, but you can see how they stagger the wind turbines, likely to reduce wake turbulence. Up here in Denmark on the left in the ocean, you can see what happens with the wind as it hits the turbines. It hits the first one, they probably get pretty good output, but the ones behind it get in this chaotic, turbulent mess of eddies and vortices, and each subsequent farm or turbine gets less power because of this. So they try not to build them like this. They try to stagger them. So based on the average wind, it'll hit the turbines differently, and they won't get hit by the turbine in front of them. So coming out of the wind, I want to talk briefly about the weather, just so you understand some other stuff I'm going to talk about. And this is, if you learn anything, I kind of just mentioned it before, you should learn this, is that when the sun comes up in the morning, it hits the ground. It doesn't hit the air and warm the air. The sun warms the ground warms the air starts to rise. So that's really important as you understand like hot air balloons. You know, it's really cold outside in the morning. They try to launch in the morning because when they light up the balloon, it's going to be warmer than anything around it, and warm air rises, and it'll rise until it's equal to the temperature around it. So in weather, we like to describe air as parcels of air, and like a little box on the ground, and I didn't draw a box, I drew like an little area. So sun comes down, hits it, and then then the heat goes back up, and it'll start to warm up the air will start to rise, and then it'll continue to rise, and if there's moisture, it'll create clouds, but if there's no moisture, it still rises. So around 8 or 10 in the morning is when you'll notice this. So if you're outside before 10, and you're like, oh, it's really warm out, and there's no wind, and then at 10, wind. Because this is when the air starts rising, it starts mixing the atmosphere up, and you start to get a breeze. So right around 10 a.m. most mornings, you'll get this breeze. And if you're going to go out on the water and do kayaking or fishing, you should go out before 10 because the water will be smooth. And then after 10 is when the wind will pick up. And it could be strong or it could just be a breeze. But that's something you should consider. Okay. So other thing that happens that's kind of an anomaly or like not normal, but it happens a lot in Pittsburgh, and it happens everywhere. It is a completely normal sort of atmospheric thing. You can't change it, is the inversion. So normally, as I just mentioned, the air rises. As it rises, it cools. Eventually, it's the same as the temperature around it, and it will stop rising. As warm air it'll only rise as long as it's warmer than everything around it, and then as soon as it's equal, it just stops, and it may decrease. With an inversion, you get warm air on top of cold air. So instead of cooling all the way up, you hit a wall. So it could start rising and then hit the cap, which is the inversion, and then stop rising. So in Pittsburgh, we get this a lot. We get cold air that comes in with a cold front, and then it sits here for a day, and then it tries to warm up, and because we have valleys that are really steep and deep, and rivers, you get trapped in cold. The cold air gets trapped down low, the warm air comes over the top, it gets really gross outside. And basically the thing you can change about inversions is what you put into an inversion. You cannot change an inversion. Nothing you make can stop an inversion. They're natural, they occur everywhere. And so we could stop, if we stop polluting the low levels of below the inversion, it won't be so gross outside. So here's an inversion. So this is in Salt Lake City. And in the mountains in the west, they have notorious inversions. It's basically the first snow, and it's the kiss of death. Because the first snow comes in, and then it gets warm after the cold air moves away, and it basically creates this layer of haze, sometimes a cloud. You can see down there below is the city, is the valley. And so this is in January, I think in 2017, I took this while hiking out there. And so you can see in here, so that's the top. I'm a little bit lower, but still kind of on top in the left image. And on the right image, that's what it looks like inside the inversion. So it's actually a lot worse than Pittsburgh there. When they have the inversion, it's even worse than that picture sometimes. It's extremely disgusting. And so it just smells a little bit. You might have flurries. It's real hazy, and it doesn't feel good to breathe. So if you're above it, and a lot of skiers take advantage of this in the spring, they go out to the mountains, they get above the inversion, they can put their t-shirt on. It's so warm up there. So you can have warm air, and then it could be in the 20s back in the valley with the inversion. So this is a classic inversion. So real quick about how we get data in the atmosphere, and I'll tie it into inversions. So there's weather balloons. The National Weather Service launches weather balloons twice a day throughout the U.S. There's one in Pittsburgh out by the airport. They launch a balloon like this. This balloon will travel way up into the sky, and then it'll pop. And when it pops, it has a little box on the bottom it's called a raw sonde or a radiosonde, and basically that's the measuring device. And then the little orange thing is a parachute. And so when the balloon pops, the parachute will take over and float safely back to Earth because they don't want the box to hit anybody. And so the box will basically report back to a receiver, and that's how we get weather data. That's what goes into computer models. Everything is about this balloon that happens. And they do this around the world, but in the US, it's very specific to certain locations, and twice a day, sunrise and sunset. So this is what it produces. Now, this looks probably like a mess, but this is called a skew-T. Now, we use this in weather every day. I worked this morning. I use this morning to look at inversions in South Dakota. So this is, you can see an inversion on here. So the inversion, again, is when it warms up with height. So what happens here on this crazy thing, and again, we use all kinds of different units in weather. This is temperature down here in Celsius. So here's 0. So temperature goes this way, increases. Temperature to the left decreases. 10 degrees Celsius is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that kind of gives you an idea where we are in the winter. This is the surface right here. Now this is Pittsburgh. I chose Pittsburgh because we're in Pittsburgh and we might understand a little bit more. So here at the surface, we're at about this elevation, which of course is in meters. And then this, I'm not going to tell you, this is in millibars, which I'm not going to describe what that is, but it's just like a way we use height in weather. So it's just basically a pressure unit. So as you increase up here, you get lower numbers, and you're at higher altitude. So right here, you can see it increasing. This is an inversion. There's another little inversion here and another here. So on this day where I took this is right before Valentine's Day this year, I basically used another website that showed me we had really bad air quality. So I knew there was an inversion set up. So this is that morning, we had really bad air quality, and this is why. So this is temperature in red, moisture is in green. And so as you go up the atmosphere, you're basically warming when it goes this way and cooling when you go this way. So this is more normal. It cools with height up to this level. This area where they're both close together, that's where there's high clouds. So high clouds form when these two meet, or clouds form when they meet. So if you're in an airplane, they say you can turn on your electronics, that occurs at this blue line. That's when you're flying. So that's about how much space you cover on this graph. When you get all the way up to this top line, that's cruising altitude, way up there. So the other thing you may or may not understand is these wind barbs. So this is all I use in weather, is this when I'm looking at wind. So the wind direction is coming from the side of this line, either that has a triangle or has the start of the tallest little vertical, or this little bar. So each bar is 10 knots, the tall ones. The short ones are 5 knots, and the triangles are 50 knots. So this is telling me we have west winds or some sort of westerly direction wind, and it quickly tells me the speed. So this is something every meteorologist should be using this every day. So the one on the left is what I just showed you. The one on the right, the one on the left is an inversion. The one on the right has an inversion, but it's above the ground. So it's more of a normal where it just decreases through height like that, and there's a little inversion right in there. So that's kind of a more normal sounding for Pittsburgh when it's not really gross outside. So this is what I'm dealing with when I'm talking about inversions and the wind. So this is what every day in the winter, there's inversions. At night, all the radiation from the sun goes back up to space. You cool off. All the cold air is dense. It wants to sit low. It sits down these valley floors. These ridges, they're about 200, they're like Pittsburgh. They're like 200, 400 feet above the valley floor. That's where the turbines are placed. They're put on the top of the ridges to get the best wind. They don't want them in the valley because that would be dumb and you wouldn't get any wind. So they put them on top of these ridges. You tap into better wind. You don't get as much of the inversion, but you still do. So sometimes the inversion does get up to the top of these, and see how close it is. It's very close, where some of the farms are in it, some are not. So this is something that in renewables, this is a big threat to renewables. If you have inversions more often, or you have inversions, a real threat is that you're going to have less wind than you expect. And the models that we use have a hard time picking this up. It's more about experience than anything, and looking for really key details in the model data to find out if you're going to have an inversion. So lastly, I'm going to wrap it up here talking briefly about climate change and kind of tie it into what this unsung villain of climate change, what I think is going to happen. So climate change, extreme weather is kind of, and extreme weather and the increasing average temperature are your two kind of poster childs for climate change. That's what people think of. You see it in the news, they talk about extreme weather, they relate it to climate change. Extreme weather, I think for a lot of it is not all climate change, but definitely the intensity of the precip and their duration, I do think is related. We've seen dramatic increases with like this one I point out, Hurricane Harvey in Houston. Before this storm, the last one they had, similar to this one, it meandered around, tropical storm, I think Allison, that one produced about 35, maybe 40 inches at the most in Houston. So they've had a really bad flooding, lots of rain. But this produced 60 inches, like dramatically more. Almost, it was similar to Hawaii, and that's nobody else close in terms of what kind of rain you can get. And it was the same kind of storm. It came in, it meandered, it just produced so much more rain. So this is where I think you're getting more intense storms, more longer duration heat waves, these really cold snaps we've seen. Even though it's climate change and they're talking about warming temperatures, it's an average. So even though you have a huge cold shot, that's only briefly 1, maybe 3 days long, and then it warms up. And the heat, and so really, as I show you the next, I think the next slide, you can see how it fluctuates. So you can have low spots because it's an average for the whole globe. And you gotta think the whole globe, not just the US. So you could be warming up and you could have cold snaps and still, the main thing is climbing. The main temperature curve is climbing. And we could still see a level off at some point a little bit, but then climb again. So this is, you can see using several major different groups and showing this, the temperature increase last, 75 years, or more than that, many years, over 75, over 100 years, and it's just showing that basically the big climb we've been having since the 1970s or so. And so I think when I think about, okay, how are you going to get this warming on for so long, and how are you going to get so much warming? How do you get extreme weather continuing? To me, it has to be some sort of blockings. Now, I'm going to have some really good graphics from National Weather Service that talk about blocking. So blocking is like in a river. You put a rock in a river, it stops the river. It has to figure out a way to get around the rock. It might back it up briefly, and then it might, or if you put sand in the water at the beach, and you're making some sort of moat or something, the water's going to find a way around it, just like the air is. So the jet stream is how storms move through the atmosphere. So a normal jet stream just kind of flows like this, like a wave. It flows really quickly across the U.S. from west to east. Storms flow across it. You get a cold front. It cools off. You get a warm air, and then it just repeats. So that's called zonal flow. That's a picture right there, and that's kind of normal. There's no kind of big storm, but there's no blocking either. So when we get blocking, we just, we had blocking with the storm in December. The thing that caused all the cold here was a blocking situation. So this is what happens in the summertime. We get these huge heat domes, and that's a form of blocking. And so what it does is this huge area of high pressure forms in the summer, and it just sits there. And so some areas under this area of high pressure, so high pressure is what it sounds like. It's high pressure pressing on the earth. It does not allow vertical motion, any vertical movement of air upward. It just squashes everything, like an inversion. It's a form of an inversion called a subsidence inversion. So a lot of times in heat waves, you'll see really hazy skies because you're getting an inversion right at the surface. And so you'll also get this really intense heat. And renewables do not do well if you're in a heat wave, basically from about right under the high pressure to the right a little bit. So the worst impact, like wind power, is going to be in this area, where you're kind of under the worst subsidence. There's no low-level jet. If there's going to be a low-level jet, it's going to be out here where it's kind of closer to what this storm coming in. This storm's going to go up and over this and not come down here. This thing is going to block all the flow. So all the flow of the jet stream goes up into Canada and goes down a little bit into the northeast, but moves on. And so this is what creates this heat wave, and it just sits there. And it's one thing to just have heat for 1 day, 2 days, but what it does, the worst I think about heat waves, is they make the night times hot. The nighttime is when you expect it to cool off. That's when you're going to get a break, especially if you don't have air conditioning or you have limited or you don't want to use a ton of power. That's the time where it needs to cool off, but in heat waves, it does not. It stays very warm, sometimes very hot. If you've ever been out to California in a heat wave, it can stay over 100 degrees past midnight. It's extremely, extremely hot. So that's one kind of blocking. The other kind, another kind is an omega block. Oh, that's not a block. So this block is shaped like an omega. So you get like an area, the jet stream kind of starts buckling like crazy. Sometimes these areas of low pressure completely break off and kind of go to the southwest or go to the southeast. So this is an area where you can get a lot of flooding. You could get flooding if these storms sit there for a long time. This area, you basically around a low pressure, the flow is like this. It's counterclockwise. High pressure flows this way, the wind. And so basically, when you go around like this, when it goes around to this point, it drags cold air down from the north. So cold air always comes in behind the storm or from the north, coming the back edge. So this could just wrap cold air around itself for a while. So you could get snow, it would be rain, it could flood in some areas because you're just not moving. This will just stay here and spin for a while. Same with this one. This one will probably work to the south a little bit and just kind of spin there. And that's kind of how we just got the big snow in California. We had a storm like this, worked down the coast. It kind of got stuck there for a while and just dumped snow, lots of snow. It was really cold. It brought a lot of cold air from the north, and it just went down there and stopped. And that's the risk. So, and then over here, if in this summertime, if you don't really see this pattern in the summer, maybe in the late spring, this could cause a heat wave, this high pressure pushing up into this part of Canada. It could be a heat wave up here. There's also a risk of inversions where mostly in here, you could get some inversions here, also out in here where you have kind of the flow around this low is from the southwest. It's bringing warm air like this. It's going over the top of this cold air. Especially in Texas, sometimes this low, it's further to the west here. And so the cold air comes into Texas and then warm air comes immediately over the top. That's how they get ice. This setup is one way they get ice. The other setup is this next one called the Rex block. This is the really bad one in terms of cold air in the east. So what this does is this can occur different ways, but you get a big, huge ridge in the jet stream. So the jet stream has to travel way up to Alaska and then come all the way back down. And when it comes back down, it might drag air from Siberia. It might drag some air from the North Pole. It basically pulls a lot of cold air to the east. This can kind of be like when you see the polar vortex. When it weakens, it does this. This whole eastern half gets all the cold air. None of it goes to the west. The west is like a block. This is a big block. So the jet stream can't go through here. It has to go over the top. And so the other thing this can do, you can get fires and really hot in British Columbia with this setup. Also fires really hot in the Pac Northwest. And then the other thing you can do is, remember the flow is like this, the flow is like this. Sometimes, so that creates this what is like east to west flow in Northern California. This can cause those really bad fires we see when they have that endless northeast or that flow from Nevada to the ocean. Sometimes they're called Santa Anas in the south, but it's basically this really strong 75 mile an hour to 100 mile an hour wind. It blows down the power lines, causes a wildfire, and then it races and it burns low-level vegetation. So the biggest thing right now, if I was in the West, I'd be concerned about is we're getting all these atmospheric rivers. We're getting all this moisture. This has happened before. And what happens, and maybe not this summer, but the following summer, is that all this rain is going to make the low vegetation grow like crazy. And so then in 2 years, it's going to dry out and be wildfire season again. So this is what those people out there are dealing with. It's like an endless cycle. It's like, how do you mitigate that? You want the rain, but you don't want them to burn all the low vegetation, and it dries out really quickly out there. And I think with climate change, the more you get these kind of winds like this, it's a drying wind. It's going to dry everything out, and so that's a big risk out there. Wildfires can continue to be a risk because of this cycle and because of this kind of block. But the other thing is, this is a big problem for inversions. Whenever this storm starts to come out, it routinely will cause inversions in Texas, Oklahoma, sometimes ice storms all the way up here. It is probably the worst for inversions. So I think that you might see more of blocking more with climate change, even more frequent. This will create more inversions, and that's the biggest risk for renewables going into the future is going to be inversions. What I see every day is what causes most of the low wind. So the unsung villain is simply, it's kind of the things that are like lurking in the shadows, but the temperature inversion, I just said, I think is number one. It is what I see on a regular basis through different ways, undercuts the wind unexpectedly. It's really hard to forecast, and as you get more and more of this blocking in the future, I think you'll get more inversions more frequently. than you do in the wind areas. It's hard to forecast for, it's hard to expect, and the kind of blocking I just showed you, I think is that kind of blocking and the omega blocking, and plus the heat wave can also cause it. I think that's where we're kind of going with climate change. Other things like subtle changes to the weather patterns that lead to shorter seasons. So times in the spring we've seen kind of be shorter, kind of weird, where everything warms up, all the vegetation grows, and then we have a freezing temperatures for a while in March and April, and then it kills everything. And then also other things like wildflowers not growing at all or coming in later or the wrong times. Greenland glaciers melting. It is very evident if you look at satellite that it is melting. If you look at the temperatures of the ocean around Greenland, that there is cold, fresh water going into the ocean. And what that's going to do is the main thing is the Gulf Stream. Now there's a lot of research in this. It's still kind of undecided how long this will take. But the Gulf Stream is what keeps Europe warm the temperature it is now. And the same reason Iceland is not completely covered in ice is because of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream runs from Florida, it runs up the east coast to Newfoundland, and then it runs over to Iceland and over into almost Europe before it ends. But it brings milder weather to them. If this Greenland icing continues, it is possible, I have read, that it's going to push the Gulf Stream a little farther south and basically lead Europe into colder temperatures, even as global warming is supposed to be warmer. So this is where averages come into play. Europe could run cold, everybody else is warm. And then other things you might see with these less cold is insects like ticks here. Could be really bad every year coming out as you're not getting as much cold, prolonged cold, not as much snow, and then just prolonged duration of precip. Lastly, just to wrap it up, renewable energy, it's a big part of the grid. It's becoming bigger and bigger as they're turning off coal, as they're turning natural gas, as everybody's kind of becoming anti-natural gas in some states, and they're going away from it. So as it becomes bigger, it's going to be very important that it comes online and that it's producing as expected, and I think temperature inversions and other patterns could have a major impact on that. I think just understanding as a meteorologist, like that low-level jet environment is so key to forecasting what's going to happen. And then just this kind of new grid technology that's coming online, I think it's a game changer, the microgrid, what it could be. Still a lot of steps and technology to take place. But I do think that also as you're looking at the different kind of heavy-duty truck charging and just electric vehicle charging, which needs to grow substantially to actually work for all the car owners we might have, I think it's going to be more of an impact on the grid just because of what's happening, what I see in renewables. So that's all I have. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much. Sammy and I will come around with microphones for questions from our on-site audience. Please kindly wait for us to bring the mic over to you because that helps our folks watching online hear the question. That also helps Scott to hear the question too. And Jane will be taking questions from our online audience. So while we start circulating here, Jane, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, our first question comes from one of our online viewers. Can you please explain why California can get 6 feet of snow and still be in a drought? If water doesn't help the drought, what will?
So the drought in California is so bad. The soil is so dry, and they get us a lot of rain. So they have the 6 feet of snow and they have rain. The reservoirs are full, but they really need more reservoir or some other way to store water because the reservoirs have been full in the past when the drought's formed. They don't have enough reservoir water to account for the drought. They've drained a lot of the groundwater. It's not going to come back in one season. So they still remain in a drought because the ground is so dry. A lot of it runs off, especially in, the valley areas. I think a lot of it runs off. They have canals to hold water, but they just don't have enough places to put all this water they're getting. And then it also will depend. The snow could make a big dent in the drought, but you won't see it until it starts melting, and that won't be till May or June, and it depends on how fast it melts. If it melts too fast and there's a threat the reservoirs will be overtopped, they'll let water out. They'll have to. And so that's kind of the problem. They need better places to store more of this water and this snow they're getting, and they just don't have it right now.
So circling back to the wind and one of the villains, that villain slide, I was curious if is one of the impacts you were talking about is that when those blocks come in, that the wind stops. So therefore, those placements cease to work for a period of time?
Well, can you repeat it? I can't hear you.
Oh. How does blocking affect production of electricity with wind turbines?
So the blocking, mainly the blocking high pressure, that's the main way that blocking will affect the wind. So in the summertime, when we need the wind especially bad, it basically, the high pressure will basically create a situation where the low-level jet that causes the wind can't form over the wind turbines. It will form, it'll be weaker out toward the front range of Colorado, kind of where I showed that graphic of the low-level jet. It basically will form out there, but you won't get the good winds further east, like Kansas, up through Iowa, and the areas of Illinois. That area will be totally suppressed. There will be no wind. There may be a little bit of wind, but it won't be enough to generate a whole lot, much power. And so it's for the areas that need that power, they're not going to have access to the volume of wind they need. And the problem with the grid is that they're so far to transfer the power across transmission lines, they can't get power in North Dakota to Chicago. It just won't get there in time by the time they need it. So it's going to have to be more local, and that's where these heat domes set up. So if the heat dome sets up further to the west, it'll just shift, and then they won't have wind in those areas. But it just kind of depends on where this heat dome is. The other blocks on here, they have wind, except when there is an inversion. So an inversion will basically be the main risk that there's no wind, and the other kinds of blocks I showed.
Do you know of any other designs for natural energy storage, like pumping the water uphill to then reuse it for hydropower? Or is it mostly like conventional battery technology, like lithium ion for energy storage beyond that?
Well, I can't hear the second part.
Are the other options mostly like lithium ion batteries or like conventional batteries? Or are there other natural options like pumping water uphill?
Yeah, I mean, the pumping the water is an option that they use to store wind power. So they actually are using that pump stores I showed. That was a way that they are storing wind power currently. They have, the lithium ion is I think their main way they're storing it. They're researching other ideas. I've seen different kinds of batteries they're working on, but that's the main way. I don't think they use the pump storage as much because they just don't have that many of those. Actually, they don't have them where there's wind. Like out here, they have some because we have some wind around on the ridges here, but they don't have wind everywhere that they have the pump storage.
Okay, another one from our online viewer. This is from Kitty Mama. Most electricity produced is wasted because we lack adequate storage technology. What progress are we making towards developing new capacitors?
I don't know how much we're working on the new capacitors, really. It's kind of beyond the scope of what I do. But I do know they're working on just new, like the microgrids. They're working on new transmission lines, but that's too long. It just takes forever to build one. They're putting wind farms in between, in the gaps where they don't have power. Is one way they're shortening how far it has to go. They are also actively building battery, but again, that's still a work in progress. I don't have an answer for the capacitor part.
You mentioned about the location maps there and where they've put a lot of them so far. Have we built out most of the good wind locations, and that's why we're now looking at a lot of the offshore ones, or is it just that the offshore ones are taking a lot longer to permit and get built and everything?
Yeah, I think so. The offshore is, I think, partially the permit. A lot of it's the permitting, and I think it's a lot of environmental and regulations, and just getting approval to do that. It's still also, I think, some of the technology, I have heard of some issues with the height of them and also mounting, either mounting or floating them out over the ocean. Are they stable? I just saw a crazy one recently that said it could actually move with the ocean currents, which I don't know how that sounds that great. But we haven't run out of wind. There are still lots of areas where there's good wind. What they're doing is they're building higher wind turbines to tap into it. And so it's basically, that's one way they're doing it. And then a lot of it comes down to subsidies in different states. Different states have different subsidies they give wind farms. And so that's kind of why Wyoming has nothing. South Dakota, I think, has a lot of land right reasons they don't have as much. But there's still lots of available wind in all the states that have it. And if they can build taller wind turbines, if you were to look at a map, which I didn't have on here, wind basically increases exponentially as you go up. So they could really tap into a significant more wind if they could just build a little bit higher on land farms.
Over here, you indicated that solar is starting to grow in the Ohio Valley at this point. I have solar panels on my roof, and the biggest issue I have is whenever it snows, it takes days for it to clear. So is your weather forecasting going to shift to be as much snow forecasting in the Ohio Valley as those solar farms start to come up?
So they have, some of the bigger solar farms have ways to clean them, and they have automated systems that go through and just wipe them. And the same for out in the desert where they have dust problems. They have automated cleaners on the actual panels, and then I think it just drives down the panels and wipes them off. And so I imagine that they'll do that for solar. That is a big issue, like for carports and roofs and stuff where you can't reach it, and they don't have the money to put in those. But these big utility farms, they have the money, and they'll do it if that's a threat to the actual power output. So I imagine that's what they'll do.
Hi, I have a question that kind of relates to that, and that is when you look at how the economics of energy are intercorrelated with the weather, are you seeing any hesitancy to build solar wind farms in areas that maybe have either bad weather generally or are starting to see bad weather? I'm thinking like Oklahoma with the tornadoes, which happened recently. And I know that there are wind farms there, but do you see any hesitancy to put resources and money into those areas where they may be destroyed?
I don't, just because it's kind of like the people that are building the wind farms that have the money, they don't necessarily seem to care as much about the bad weather. Tornadoes they do hit wind farms. I mean, they're right there in the middle of Tornado Alley, so they occasionally do have impacts. But it's such a low chance that they're going to have issues. More likely they're going to have ice. Ice is such a bigger threat to them, and really strong winds that might cause them to cut off. And they still build, because I think it's more of an economic reason. They're getting subsidies for it. There's tax incentives. Different states have that. Now you look at like Pennsylvania if you look at New Jersey for homeowners has great tax incentives. So New Jersey has the highest amount of solar on residential and commercial of any state, and that's any member of the PJM market, which includes like Chicago and DC and parts of New York City. And it's because of they're so friendly. But Pennsylvania has hardly any, because Pennsylvania is they're not anti, they just haven't passed the rules for community solar, or we have it at residential, but you can't have community solar here yet, which is a big way. It's kind of a way for people who can't have rooftop to buy into solar. Other states allow that. So like New Jersey allows that, so they have tons of solar. And they still don't have the greatest weather, but they're able to get enough solar power just from the regular ambient light and the days they do have sun. So it's really a state-by-state issue more with like rules and regulations.
Okay, this is again from Kitty Mama. Having lived in Pittsburgh for 7+ years, do you think installing solar panels on my roof is worthwhile? In other words, will I save money over time compared to the amount of electricity I get, and how much will I help the environment?
I definitely think, I think it's worth it if you have the right kind of roof that's going to receive lots of sun. So my house, unfortunately, is overshadowed by a giant house next door. So my house will never receive very much sun. So I'm not going to put solar on my roof because it's never going to get I don't think I will save money on my bill. But if you do have a south-facing roof or a roof that has lots of sun exposure, then yes, I believe you will get a significant output. If you also have an electric vehicle and you can plug into your house, this is also a way that I think in the future you'll be able to save money either with your solar panels and then using your car as like a storage place for power as well. That's a way. And then what was the second part of the question?
Sorry, how will it impact the environment?
So, I mean, immediately in Pittsburgh, I don't think it has really any impact because you're just absorbing the energy on your roof and it's going into the grid. But in terms of you're not taking power, I mean, it's less. Eventually, I think it's less use of the power from the power plants. So, if enough people have power, it's just a little bit that you're helping the environment by not taking power from the fossil fuel plants, whether it's coal or natural gas or whatever it is around here.
So about 10 years ago, I think I read a book where it was the signal and the noise, and it was describing that the best weather forecasts are with models and human beings interpreting them and coming out with the final prediction. And it looks like you do a similar thing. You use models at some point, but then you also use your own knowledge. Now there's AI has been in the news quite a bit. Are you using AI tools? Will those be used in the same way? Or worst case, 10 years from now, will you be replaced with some AI model?
You know, it's interesting you ask that. For a while, we were having to go, so there's one of our vendor, it's kind of a vendor competitor. They produce automatic wind forecasts. There's no person. And so we have to compete against them. It's basically our traders will look at their forecast and we have to say, why are they where they are? I mean, are they right or are you right? And they actually they have Watson. They were formerly with IBM, so they were using Watson, and that was what was making their forecast. So we were having to battle, and so I would say that it's not that great because the problem is with the AI or any of the computers is they still seem to smooth out a lot of curves, and that's where the money is. Where those little dips occur, anything small you can see, that's where there's money in the market, or even in anything else. That's where the computers fell on any forecast, is they smooth out the data too much in the little time constraints, and that's where the human forecaster can see it. So that's always been the advantage. If they can do that, when they can do that, then they will replace me.
Okay, from one of our online viewers, how much wind energy research involves capturing winds from tornadoes and hurricanes?
They may use a little bit. So Texas Tech has a really good wind research university. They have all kinds of wind tunnels, and they do a lot of tests with this. And so they may use some of the stuff from tornadoes, what they learn. They are experts in a lot of tornado winds. And then hurricanes, like other universities that are near the ocean, Florida State might have one, some other universities. Randomly, Colorado State has a good tropical like meteorology program. And so they might use some data from that, but I don't know if they're using a lot of it. A lot of when the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Denver, NREL, they do a lot of research into all kinds of things, and they may do some like that, especially tornadoes. Just to understand how it affects when storms go through the low-level environment. Hurricanes, I don't know, because the wind speed for wind turbines is so low that where they max out, that it's not really that high as hurricanes. Now, if a hurricane comes, they turn the farms off because that kind of wind will destroy the farm if they're running. And they still may destroy those farms. I think they're rated pretty high against wind, but damage from a hurricane. But I don't think they use it a lot. I think a lot of what they're doing is they have towers with weather stations they put up next to where they're going to build a farm. They do a lot of research before they're going to build it, using different kind of observations at that level. And then a lot of it's computer models they're using. I know a lot of the people that build the wind farms have a special software that helps them lay them out based on the average winds. So it's a lot of computers.
This one is from online viewer BG. In light of climate change, are there areas of the country that are not viable for renewables today due to legacy weather patterns that are being forecast to be better or viable in the future as climate patterns evolve?
Yeah, I think there's like, I know there's a big push in the southeast. There's not a lot of wind or solar anywhere in like Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, those areas. In Louisiana, there's not a whole lot. And those areas may be better. I don't think we're going to see a huge change in the weather patterns. I mean, we'll see these blocking, but in between the blocks, I think it's just going to be more of the similar weather patterns. So I think what's going to change is the technology. So they'll build taller turbines. They'll make solar panels that work in better in worse conditions that are more efficient. They'll make other kinds of renewable energy. There are other kinds that they don't have yet, but they'll make those, I think, bigger, different kinds of renewables. But I don't think there's going to be a huge shift in the patterns. I just think that in blocking, yes, but blocking will be intermittent. It won't be all the time. All the time will be just the normal weather patterns we have today. So I don't see that, but I see technology coming along, and so Southeast U.S., maybe more of the Western U.S. will get more involved. It'll also depend a lot, I think, on these markets that we trade in. The markets are trying to expand into the West and to the Southeast all the time. So if they can get those guys on board, then once there's a market, then they will build renewables because of the money, the financial reason.
Do microgrids improve the resiliency of the grid on a small scale, or if they're subject to the same local weather events that would cause grid issues, you just end up having to draw from the larger grid as a whole whenever the weather's bad?
Yeah, if they had an issue, it would be something small scale. And like a microgrid, I think for the most part, if they had say a lot of cloud cover and they were just endless, then they couldn't get their batteries charged before it, then yeah, they can tap into the larger grid, but they can also, what they call islanding, they can basically become an island, and they can separate from the grid and operate on their own if the grid's having trouble. So that's the big advantage, that they can separate, and that's probably one of the big things they're working on, making sure it works efficiently to do that. I think that if there's a storm like a hurricane, now that can damage a microgrid, just destroy the infrastructure, and that happens, I think, to some of the stuff down in the Caribbean where they've had hurricanes and they have solar, some of it got destroyed if it's not mounted securely enough or if the winds are just so strong. So.
We talked a lot about weather and weather-related, wind, solar, hydro. I've not heard much about this, and maybe there really isn't much research into it, but what about the tides? Seems like an inexhaustible source of energy.
Yeah, so there is tidal renewables is a thing, and it's just not a thing in the U.S., it seems. A lot of work in Denmark and the Netherlands areas and maybe even the UK a little bit, I'm not sure, but they definitely have it, and it is a reasonable type of renewable because you're correct, you always have waves, and it just works on the rising and lowering of the waves, and it's the same thing, it just turns like a turbine as it goes up and down and creates electricity and sends it back to the shore. So it is a really good type of renewable that I've seen a lot of stories about them building them, but never really in the U.S. has it taken off.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, both live and online. And thank you very much for our wonderful speaker tonight, Scott, thank you. And I'd like to remind everybody that April 3rd will be our next Café Sci, and we would love to see you back. Thank you.
Please don't forget to take your trash on the way out, too.